The train station was alive with movement that morning. People hurried in every direction, dragging heavy suitcases, clutching coffee cups, and calling out to family members to keep up. The loudspeaker above announced arrivals and departures, and the sound of rolling wheels against the tiled floor filled the air. Among all this noise and rush stood a man who seemed different from the rest. He was tall, dressed in a fine suit that looked like it had been tailored just for him, and his shoes shined so brightly that they reflected the station's lights. His name was Richard, though most of the world knew him as a billionaire investor who owned companies in several countries. He was waiting for his private train carriage, which was scheduled to depart soon. Unlike the other passengers who rushed in nervous hurry, Richard stood calm, glancing at his expensive watch as though time itself waited for him. Richard was known for his discipline. Every second of his day was planned by his assistant. Every deal, every meeting, and every trip was calculated. The train was just a short journey he had to take before his next meeting in another city where important people waited for him. To Richard, this day was meant to be ordinary, another step in his endless schedule. But life has a way of writing surprises when we least expect them. As he adjusted his tie and scrolled through messages on his phone, his eyes caught something unusual just a few feet away. Two young girls stood close together near one of the station benches. Their clothes were old and a little torn, their shoes dusty as if they had walked a long way. The girls were identical twins, no older than 10. Their hair was tied back in messy ponytails, and though they looked tired, their eyes were bright with a kind of desperate hope. Richard tried to look away, reminding himself that he had no time for distractions, but something about their faces made him glance back again and again. They were not playing or laughing like most children would. Instead, they clutched each other's hands tightly as if the world around them was too big and too dangerous. Suddenly, the twins stepped forward. Before Richard realized what was happening, they stood right in front of him. Their small voices, trembling but filled with courage, spoke words that silenced the noise around him. "Please don't leave us." The sound of their plea was so clear and raw that even the travelers nearby slowed down to listen. People turned their heads, curious why two children were speaking like that to a man in a suit who looked like he belonged in a glass office tower, not a crowded station. Richard froze. For a moment, his mind was blank. He had been approached by thousands of people in his life, business partners, employees, journalists, even strangers asking for favors, but never had he been faced with two children begging him in such a way. His assistant, who stood a few steps behind carrying Richard's briefcase, frowned deeply and whispered, "Sir, let's move. We don't have time for this." But Richard didn't move. His heart, usually locked behind numbers and deals, felt something unusual stir inside it. The girls' eyes filled with tears. They repeated their plea, "Please don't leave us." Their voices cracked, and it felt less like a request and more like a cry from their very souls. The station grew strangely quiet, as if even the trains were waiting to hear what would happen. Passengers slowed down, some pulling out their phones to capture the scene. A few whispered to each other, wondering if the girls were lost or if they knew the man somehow. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to ask them who they were, where their parents were, why they were speaking to him in such a way. But at that moment, words refused to form. All he could do was look at the children standing before him, fragile yet fearless, begging him not to walk away. In that instant, memories from his own past, long buried and carefully hidden, rose like a tide. He remembered being a boy himself, waiting at a station not unlike this one, hoping someone would come back for him. He remembered what it felt like to be forgotten. The assistant tugged gently at Richard's arm again, reminding him of the train schedule, but Richard remained still. He had faced boardrooms full of powerful people without hesitation. He had signed deals worth billions without blinking an eye. Yet here, in front of two small girls, his heart raced and his hands trembled. The crowd around them grew, people whispering and pointing, but the twins kept their eyes locked on his. There was no trick, no performance. Their plea was real. For Richard, this was the start of something he could not explain. A man who had lived a life of control suddenly found himself caught in a moment he did not control at all. The billionaire at the station, the twins in their worn clothes, the crowd holding its breath. This unlikely meeting was the beginning of a story that would soon travel far beyond the station walls. And though Richard did not yet know it, his life, built on wealth and power, was about to be shaken by the simplest words of two children: "Please don't leave us." The station crowd was still murmuring about what had just happened, but for Richard, the world seemed to shrink until there were only 3 people left in it: himself and the twin girls. Their small hands were still holding onto each other as though if they let go, everything would collapse. Richard bent down slightly so he could see them better. Their eyes were wet but steady, showing both fear and courage at the same time. They were clearly frightened, yet they had the strength to walk up to a stranger and speak. "Who are you?" Richard asked softly, his voice calmer than he expected. He wanted to sound gentle, though inside he felt a storm of confusion. The twins looked at each other for a moment, as if deciding who should answer. Finally, the girl on the left spoke in a shaky voice. "I'm Emily," she said. She squeezed her sister's hand. "This is my sister, Emma." Richard nodded slowly. "Where are your parents?" he asked. His assistant shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly wishing Richard would not get involved. The question made both girls lower their heads. Their lips trembled, but Emma answered this time. They left us here," she whispered. "We don't know why. They said they would come back, but they never did." Her words struck Richard in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't only what she said, it was how she said it. It was the quiet tone of a child who had repeated the same story many times, hoping one day the ending might change. Richard felt his throat tighten. The assistant interrupted quickly, whispering, "Sir, these girls could be exaggerating. You don't know them. We really must go. The board members are waiting." But Richard didn't listen. His eyes were fixed on the twins, who now began telling their story, each adding small details while the other nodded to confirm. They explained how they had been traveling with their uncle. He had promised to take them to visit a family friend. But at the station, he left them on a bench with a bag of snacks and told them he'd return soon. That was 2 days ago. Since then, they had been waiting, hoping each passing train would bring him back. At night, when the station grew quiet, the girls huddled together on the cold bench, too afraid to sleep deeply. The station staff had noticed them but assumed they were waiting for someone. A few kind strangers had offered food, but nobody had taken responsibility for them. They had survived on sandwiches, bottles of water, and the hope that their uncle would keep his promise. Richard listened without moving. Every word the twins spoke painted a picture he could not ignore. He imagined them sitting in the hard wooden benches while the station lights dimmed, their small frames shivering under thin jackets. He imagined the confusion in their eyes when the hours turned into days. And he imagined the crushing loneliness of being forgotten. As the girls continued, Richard's mind drifted back to his own boyhood. He remembered nights when he too had felt abandoned. His parents had worked long hours, leaving him alone with nothing but silence for company. He had waited many evenings by the window, hoping to see headlights turn into the driveway, only to fall asleep with disappointment. Though his story was not as severe as the twins, the feeling was the same, an ache that never fully healed. "Why did you come to me?" Richard finally asked, his voice rough with emotion. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because you look like someone who can help us. People walk by, but they don't stop. You look like you could do something." Emma added quietly, "And you remind us of our father, before he went away." The words pierced through Richard's heart like an arrow. He wanted to speak but could not. For a man used to controlling every situation, he now felt powerless in the face of 2 children's trust. The assistant tried again. Sir, this could delay everything. Report them to the station manager, and someone else can handle it. It's not your responsibility. But Richard shook his head slightly. He could not turn away. He noticed now how thin the girls' arms were, how their shoes had holes, how their cheeks carried the pale look of children who had not eaten enough. Around them, the crowd was still watching. Some people whispered in admiration of the billionaire's attention. Others judged silently, wondering if he was about to be tricked. But none of that mattered to Richard. He crouched down so that he was eye level with them. Tell me, he asked, what is it that you want from me? The twins looked at each other again, their eyes filling with tears. Then Emily spoke, her voice quiet but steady. We don't want money. We don't want presents. We just want a family who won't leave us again. The simplicity of the request left Richard speechless. For all his billions, for all the wealth he had gathered across continents, he had never heard a request so pure, so stripped of everything except the need for love and safety. His heart ached, not just for the girls, but for himself too. Because he realized, in that very moment, that all the power and success in his life had not filled the emptiness of belonging he once longed for. A silence spread between them. Then Emma whispered something even softer, we thought maybe you could be that person. The words struck him harder than any business negotiation ever could. His assistant sighed heavily, clearly frustrated, but Richard ignored him. He took a deep breath, steadying his emotions. The station's loudspeaker announced another arrival, but no one in the circle around them moved. The passengers, the workers, the bystanders, everyone seemed frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. For Richard, time slowed. He was standing at a crossroad of choice. He could walk away, hide behind the excuse of being busy, and no one would truly blame him. Or he could do something that might change not just the lives of the twins but his own life as well. Richard's chest rose and fell as he stared at the children before him. His life had been a journey of numbers and contracts, but this was not a deal to be signed. This was a plea for humanity. A plea that awakened something in him he thought he had lost years ago. The twins' story, their innocence and their bravery began to echo in his mind. He saw them not as strangers but as mirrors of the boy he once was, lonely, waiting, hoping. And deep inside, he knew this meeting was not an accident. It was a reminder. It was a test of what he valued most, money or compassion. As he stood in that train station, surrounded by strangers and held by the gaze of two abandoned girls, Richard felt his heart take a step toward an answer. Richard stood in silence for what felt like a very long time. The world around him moved on, the train still roared in and out of the station, the loudspeaker continued to call out destinations, and travelers hurried to their platforms, but he felt suspended in a moment that demanded a decision. The twins' words kept circling in his head, we just want a family who won't leave us again. His assistant leaned in, speaking in a low but firm tone. Sir, we really cannot afford to waste time here. The car is waiting outside. The meeting will not wait for you. These children, they are not your problem. But for the first time in years, Richard did not care about the meeting. He didn't even care about his carefully laid out schedule. He only cared about the two children standing before him with pleading eyes. A part of him, the businessman trained to be cautious, warned him that this might complicate his life. Yet another part, the part he had long buried under layers of success and pride, whispered that walking away would haunt him forever. He crouched down once more, looking at Emily and Emma closely. Do you have anywhere to go? He asked. Both girls shook their heads. We've been here since he left, Emily said quietly. We wait every morning. We hope maybe today he'll come back. But he never does. Emma added, we don't know where else to go. The answer broke Richard's heart. He imagined them waking up each morning on that same hard bench, clutching their little bag of snacks, waiting for a face that never appeared. He saw them watching people reunite with loved ones, while their own hope slowly crumbled. Richard's assistant sighed in frustration. "Sir, if you must, call the station authorities. They will know how to handle them. You don't need to involve yourself personally." But Richard didn't want to leave this to strangers. He wanted to know more. He wanted to be sure they were safe. He wanted to understand why they chose him out of everyone in the station. He gently asked, "Why did you stop me? Why not someone else?" Emily squeezed her sister's hand tighter before answering. "We tried to ask other people before," she admitted. "They gave us food or told us to wait for the police. But no one stayed. No one really looked at us." She paused, then said in a voice almost too soft to hear, "When we saw you, we thought you looked like you wouldn't walk away." The words hit Richard like a wave. Out of thousands of strangers, these children had trusted him. Not because of his wealth, not because of his name, but because in that brief moment, they saw something in his eyes, something he had almost forgotten was there. The assistant tried again, his voice sharper now. "Sir, the train will leave without us." Richard stood up slowly, straightened his shoulders, and turned to his assistant. "If it leaves, it leaves," he said firmly. "I am not going anywhere until I make sure these girls are safe." The assistant opened his mouth in protest but then closed it when he saw the determination in Richard's face. For years he had worked with the billionaire and had rarely seen him deviate from his plans. This was new. This was different. The twins looked at him with wide eyes, almost disbelieving that he was still there. "So you won't leave us?" Emma asked. "No," Richard said, his voice steady. "I won't leave you." The relief that washed over their faces was instant. Emily's shoulders slumped as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Emma wiped her eyes with her sleeve and let out a shaky breath. For the first time since meeting them, Richard saw a small smile flicker across their lips. The crowd around them had grown larger. Passengers had slowed down to witness the unusual sight of a billionaire kneeling in the middle of a station, speaking with two abandoned children. Some whispered words of admiration. Others shook their heads skeptically. A few began recording the scene on their phones. But Richard was unaware of all that. His world was focused only on the twins. He led them to a quieter corner of the station where they could sit down on a bench together. He asked them more questions: what they remembered about their uncle, if they knew where he lived, if they had any relatives. The answers were vague, uncertain, and filled with gaps. It was clear the girls had been left with very little information. As they spoke, Richard noticed how tired they looked. Their eyes were heavy, their voices faint, and their small bodies leaned against each other for support. He signaled his assistant to bring water and food from the station cafe. Reluctantly, the assistant obeyed, returning with sandwiches, fruit, and bottles of water. The girls ate slowly at first, then more eagerly as their hunger became clear. Richard watched them, a mixture of sadness and determination in his heart. When they finished, Emily looked up and whispered, "Thank you." Richard smiled faintly. "It's nothing," he said, though deep inside he knew it was not nothing. To them, a simple meal meant the world. The station's loudspeaker announced again that Richard's train was ready to depart. His assistant stood nervously, torn between duty and disbelief. "Sir, if we miss this train, we'll have to rearrange everything. The shareholders will not be pleased." Richard took a deep breath, then spoke with certainty. "They will wait. These girls cannot." The assistant stared at him as though he had lost his mind, but Richard felt more certain than ever. For years, he had measured his life in profit margins and market shares. But here, in this station, he realized that true worth was measured differently. It was measured in moments of compassion, in the ability to choose kindness over convenience. The twins leaned closer to him, as though afraid he might still change his mind. But he didn't. He placed a hand gently on each of their shoulders and said, "From this moment, you are not alone. I promise you that." The girls nodded, their eyes shimmering with tears, not of fear this time, but of hope. For the first time since their ordeal began, they believed they were safe. The crowd, sensing the weight of the moment, began clapping softly. Some even wiped their eyes. Strangers who had never met Richard before now looked at him with respect, not for his wealth, but for his humanity. As Richard sat with the twins, he realized this was more than just a choice. This was a turning point. He had been given everything in life: fortune, power, recognition, but now life was giving him something greater, the chance to be human again. In that crowded train station, under the bright lights and echoing announcements, a billionaire's heart opened wide to two small children who had asked for nothing more than love and safety. And though he didn't yet know exactly how he would help them, he knew one thing for certain: he would not fail them. Not now, not ever. The scene at the train station did not stay hidden for long. In today's world, where almost every person carried a phone capable of capturing pictures and videos, moments like this traveled quickly. By the time Richard had guided the twins to the waiting area and asked his assistant to arrange a private lounge where they could rest, the story had already begun to spread. Dozens of people had recorded him kneeling to speak with the girls, and others had shared it online. By evening, social media would be flooded with headlines about a billionaire choosing compassion over business. But in that moment, Richard wasn't thinking about the cameras or the world outside. His mind was on Emily and Emma, who now sat quietly beside him, eating the warm food brought from the station cafe. Their small faces looked brighter after having real food and water. Yet there was still a lingering sadness in their eyes, a sadness that reminded Richard of the wounds that only time and love could heal. He spoke gently to them, asking if they felt better. They nodded shyly, their voices too faint to answer. He knew then that this was only the beginning. The assistant stood in the corner of the lounge, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. He was used to Richard being sharp, efficient, and focused on profit. Now, watching his employer spend precious hours sitting with two children, he didn't know what to think. "Sir," he said carefully, "I understand your feelings, but we cannot ignore your schedule. People are waiting. The media will spin this however they want. Maybe it's best if we leave them with the authorities and move on." Richard looked at him with a steady gaze. "If the media wants to talk, let them. If the board is upset, they will learn patience. I will not abandon these children just to attend another meeting." The assistant fell silent. He had never seen Richard speak this way, with such conviction that no business matter could overshadow it. Meanwhile, outside the lounge, the crowd of onlookers had grown. Some people pressed their faces to the glass to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. A few journalists who happened to be at the station rushed to call their editors. By the time the next train departed, local news channels were already preparing to cover the story. The image of a billionaire staying behind with two abandoned girls was too powerful to ignore. Inside, Richard turned his attention back to the twins. "Do you know what will happen next?" he asked softly. Emma shook her head. "We only know we don't want to be alone again." Richard nodded. "And you won't be." His voice was calm, but in his heart he felt the weight of responsibility settling firmly on his shoulders. A knock came at the door, and two station officers entered politely. They had been informed of the situation by staff. "Sir," one officer said, "we understand you've taken in these two girls. Normally, we would take them into our care and hand them over to child services. It is the proper procedure." Richard listened carefully. The girls instantly clutched his arms, fear flooding their faces at the thought of being separated again. He placed a reassuring hand over theirs. "I understand your rules," he said to the officers, "but I want to make sure they are safe. I will personally take responsibility for them until we know what child services will decide." The officers exchanged glances. It wasn't every day that a billionaire insisted on personally involving himself in such matters. They nodded cautiously. "Very well, sir. We will allow it for now, but child services must be contacted immediately." Richard agreed. He asked his assistant to make the necessary calls, ensuring everything was done by the book. While the assistant handled the details, Richard stayed with the twins, speaking softly to them. He told them about the journey ahead, that they would see doctors to make sure they were healthy, that they would have a safe place to stay, and that he would not disappear like the uncle who had abandoned them. The girls listened, still scared but slowly beginning to believe his words. By late afternoon, reporters had arrived at the station. Cameras flashed as they tried to catch a glimpse of Richard leaving the lounge with the twins by his side. His security team quickly formed a shield around him, but not before microphones caught the shouts of journalists. "Mr. Kane, are you adopting them? Mr. Kane, is this just for publicity? What will your shareholders say about this delay?" Richard did not answer. He guided the girls carefully into his waiting car and shut the door. Inside, the twins sat close to him, their small hands still gripping his coat sleeve. He looked at them and smiled gently. "Don't worry about the noise outside. What matters is that you're safe now." The car drove through the city streets, but Richard's mind was already racing. He knew this was more than just helping two children for a day. This was about creating something lasting. As the skyline passed by outside the window, he thought of his vast fortune and the many foundations he had supported from a distance. He had written checks for causes he barely followed. But this was different. This was personal. That evening, after ensuring the twins had a warm meal and a comfortable bed in his guest residence, Richard made several phone calls. He spoke to lawyers, child service officials, and doctors. He wanted to know what needed to be done to protect Emily and Emma legally and properly. He wanted to be sure they would never again face the kind of abandonment they had endured. When the media reported on the story that night, the public response was overwhelming. Some people praised him as a hero, while others doubted his intentions. "Maybe it's just a show," some critics said. "Maybe he's trying to improve his public image." But those who had been at the station knew the truth. They had seen the sincerity in his actions, the way he had chosen the children over his meeting, the way he had looked into their eyes and promised not to leave them. The next morning, as the twins woke up in clean clothes and soft beds, they found Richard sitting at the breakfast table with them. He asked how they slept, if they liked their food, if they wanted to play outside after eating. The girls smiled shyly, slowly adjusting to the warmth of safety. For Richard, those smiles were more rewarding than any successful business deal. In the days that followed, child services worked with him to arrange guardianship. Richard made it clear he was not trying to take shortcuts. He wanted everything legal, fair, and in the best interest of the twins. He also announced the creation of a new foundation, one that would specifically support abandoned children and ensure they were given not just shelter but education, love, and opportunities to thrive. The world watched in amazement. A man once known for his sharp deals and relentless pursuit of profit was now becoming a symbol of compassion. But for Richard, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the two little girls who had trusted him at the station, who had said the words that changed his life, "Please don't leave us." And as he saw them laughing softly in the garden of his estate, he knew one thing for certain: he had no intention of ever leaving them again. Weeks passed after the unforgettable day at the train station, and the lives of Emily and Emma began to transform in ways neither of them could have imagined. The twins were no longer sleeping on a cold bench under flickering station lights. Instead, they woke up each morning in soft beds covered with warm blankets, surrounded by the safety of walls that kept out the night's chill. They were cared for by people who made sure they ate properly, attended school, and had doctors to check on their health. Most importantly, they no longer felt invisible. They were seen, they were valued, and they were loved. Richard kept his promise. He didn't vanish after the news cameras left or after the public excitement settled down. He visited them daily, sometimes for breakfast, sometimes in the evening after work. He wasn't always able to spend hours with them, but he made sure they knew he was present in their lives. Each time he walked through the door, the twins' faces lit up with the kind of joy that only children who had once known fear of abandonment could feel. The world outside continued to discuss the billionaire's surprising actions. Newspapers carried headlines about him choosing compassion over business. News anchors debated whether this was the start of a new chapter in his life or just an unusual moment of kindness. Some praised him as a role model for leaders everywhere. Others remained skeptical, insisting there must be a hidden reason behind his generosity. But Richard didn't let the voices of the world distract him. His focus remained on the promise he had made to two children who trusted him when no one else had. One afternoon, Richard arranged for the twins to visit their new school for the first time. They had never been to a proper classroom before. As they walked in, holding his hands tightly, the other children turned curiously to look at them. Emily and Emma were nervous at first, afraid they might be treated as outsiders. But Richard knelt down and whispered, "Remember, you belong here as much as anyone else. You are brave, and you deserve every good thing coming your way." His steady words gave them the courage to take their seats. By the end of the day, the twins had already made a few friends. They returned home with stories of learning new words, drawing pictures, and playing in the schoolyard. For Richard, hearing their laughter was a victory greater than signing any business contract. Meanwhile, Richard's new foundation for abandoned children was beginning to grow. He invested not only money but also his time. He hired experts who understood children's needs, psychologists, teachers, and social workers. He insisted that the foundation would not just provide shelter but also love, education, and hope. "Every child deserves a chance to dream," he said during the launch ceremony. "No child should have to beg for a family at a train station." His words touched hearts around the world. Donations poured in from people inspired by his story. But beyond the public attention, the most meaningful moments for Richard were the quiet ones with the twins. One evening, after dinner, Emily handed him a drawing she had made. It showed three figures holding hands: a tall man in a suit and two small girls on either side. Above them, she had written the words, "Our family." Richard's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the picture. He had been called many things in his life: businessman, billionaire, tycoon, but the simple word family written by a child's hand was the title he cherished most. Emma, who had once been shy and fearful, began to open up too. She liked to sit beside Richard while he worked, asking him questions about his travels and the tall buildings he owned. "Do those buildings touch the sky?" she asked one evening, her eyes wide with wonder. Richard chuckled softly. "Not quite, but they try," he replied. Her curiosity reminded him of his own youth, when he had looked at the world with endless possibilities before life became consumed by profit and deadlines. For Richard, the twins were teaching him as much as he was giving them. They taught him patience, joy in simple things, and the value of presence over possessions. They reminded him of the part of himself he had once forgotten: the boy who had once waited at a window for someone to come home. Now he had a chance to be the person who came home, the person who stayed. As months passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Richard worked with child services and legal teams to ensure the twins had permanent guardianship with trusted caretakers he personally chose. Though he was not in a position to raise them entirely on his own, he made sure their guardians were kind, educated, and capable of providing a stable home. Yet, he remained a constant figure in their lives, visiting often, guiding their education, and ensuring they never felt abandoned again. Public opinion began to shift as people saw his consistency. What some had dismissed as a publicity stunt proved to be genuine. His foundation opened its first shelter in the city within months, housing dozens of children who, like Emily and Emma, had been left without families. Reporters who visited were surprised to find Richard there in person, reading stories to children, playing simple games, and listening to their dreams. "I thought I'd meet a businessman," one reporter admitted, "but what I found was a man who discovered his humanity." On the anniversary of the day he met the twins, Richard arranged a small gathering at the train station where it all began. He invited staff from the station, the officers who had helped, and some of the foundation's first children. Emily and Emma stood proudly beside him, now healthier, happier, and more confident than before. As they looked at the same spot where they had once begged him not to leave, Richard felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. That single moment had changed everything, not just for them, but for him as well. In his speech, Richard said, "A year ago, I stood here as a man who thought wealth was measured in numbers. But two little girls reminded me that true wealth is measured in lives touched, in promises kept, and in hearts that are no longer afraid. That day, I thought I was helping them. But in truth, they saved me from forgetting what matters most." The crowd applauded warmly, many wiping tears from their eyes. That evening, as the sun set and trains continued to come and go, Richard walked with Emily and Emma to the platform. The girls no longer looked afraid of being left behind. Instead, they held his hands with confidence, knowing they were no longer alone. The billionaire who once lived for profit now lived for purpose, and the world around him had been shocked, inspired, and changed by his choice. For the twins, the man they had trusted in desperation became more than a rescuer. He became the symbol of hope that their lives would never again be defined by fear of abandonment. And for Richard, the words "please don't leave us" became not a burden but a gift. A gift that reminded him, every single day, of the power of compassion. In the end, the story of the billionaire and the twin girls became more than just a headline. It became a lesson shared in classrooms, workplaces, and homes, a reminder that sometimes, the greatest riches are not counted in gold or shares, but in the love we give and the lives we change.